Alright, leaving off from our last video, you were asked to complete the square on this trinomial. That's our general quadratic equation. Has no numbers in it. You were supposed to try to do the process of completing the square and see what you could come up with. I'm also going to say that for this video you need to have your calculator sitting next to you, so go ahead and grab that if you don't have it already. But to get started, I just want to show you, I'm going to complete the square, okay? And you don't have to write all of this down, but I want you to see where all of this comes from so you understand. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of the work, and then I'm going to talk through it. Alright, all of that should have just appeared on the screen for you. So first thing in red, I went through and I divided everything through by the leading coefficient a. Then I set up my completing the square just like we did in the last video. So I took my b term, which in this case was b divided by a, divided it by 2, squared it. Okay, that's b over 2a, square it is b squared over 4a squared. Add that to both sides. We know that on this side, this last thing before we squared it is the term that goes in here to make our binomial squared. And then this side, okay, I did some work to find a common denominator down here in the black writing. 4a squared is the common denominator, so I had to multiply this by 4a. Then took a square root of both sides to get rid of the square. After that, plus or minus, take the square root of the top. I just rewrote it with b squared first instead of having that negative sign first. And the square root of 4a squared is just 2a. Then I took this b over 2a, subtracted it over. These have a common denominator, wrote it as one final formula. Hopefully you recognize that as the quadratic formula. Okay, x is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This is the embarrassing part of me having to make this video. I am going to sing a quadratic formula song. I definitely suggest to you that you commit it to memory. It will help you every time you need the quadratic formula, so you don't have to complete the square every time. So, here goes. X equals opposite b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, you can rewind that tape as many times as you want to listen to that song, but I would definitely suggest that you commit it to memory so that instead of completing the square every single time, you can just use the formula, because the formula is completing the square. Alright, so the important part of the formula, or a part that can give us some important information, is what we call the discriminant, which is this b squared minus 4ac. That's the part that is underneath the square root. Okay? So, thinking about the discriminant, it helps us figure out how many roots or how many solutions we're looking for, which will also tell us how many times the graph crosses the x-axis. There are 3 different situations. A quadratic, or a parabola, can cross twice. It can cross exactly once, where it's going to touch and then bounce back, or it cannot cross the axis at all. Okay? So the discriminant helps us figure that out. We're going to start down here. If your discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, is less than 0, so if this comes out as a negative, you don't have any real solutions, because this parabola, either it's going to be all above and opening up, or it might be all below and opening down, is never going to cross the x-axis. So while there are no real solutions, you will have 2 imaginary solutions. Okay? So you can write it as no real solution, but I would prefer that you write 2 imaginary solutions, because you will find them. They will just have eyes in them. If b squared minus 4ac is exactly equal to 0, that means there's one solution, because your parabola either sits on the x-axis, opening up, or it might touch the x-axis, all existing below. Okay, so you'll have exactly one solution. And then this last one, if b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, so positive, your parabola is going to intersect with the x-axis twice. Okay, it could be twice opening up, it could have been twice opening down, but it is going to intersect twice. If this number comes out as a perfect square, that just means that your answers are rational, which means you probably could have gotten away with factoring to find those values, and you didn't need the quadratic formula to help you find the irrational ones. But again, if your discriminant is negative, there are 2 imaginary solutions. If your discriminant is equal to 0, there's exactly one real solution. And if your discriminant is positive, there are 2 real solutions. I would make sure that you write kind of this extra information on your notes sheet so you have it to look back at. Alright, use the discriminant to identify how many or what kind of solutions each quadratic will have, and then solve. So our discriminant is going to be b squared minus 4ac. 3 squared is 9, minus 4 times 1 is 4, times 10 is 40. Our discriminant is equal to negative 31. Well, looking back at our list, if our discriminant came out negative, that means we have 2 imaginary solutions. So our parabola is never going to cross the x-axis, but we can still find the roots of the quadratic. So using the quadratic formula, we have x equals opposite of b plus or minus, well, the square root of b squared minus 4ac, we already did that work, okay? The discriminant, we've already done the work for it, you don't have to do it again, all over 2a. So that means that x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus. This negative 31 can be rewritten as I. Root 31 is not going to simplify at all, over 2. And there are your 2 imaginary solutions. Negative 3 plus I rad 31 over 2, and negative 3 minus I rad 31 over 2. Alright, this next one, again, we're in standard form, so we've got a, b, and c. Let's go ahead and use the discriminant. b squared minus 4ac. This is going to be 16 minus 4 times 1 is 4, times negative 6 is negative 24, so minus a negative 24. 16 plus 24, which gives us a discriminant of 40. Again, looking back at your list until you get the hang of it, if we have a number greater than 0, we're going to have 2 real solutions. Now we got to go ahead and find those real solutions. So x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root, etc., etc. You already did your b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. This one, we don't have to deal with any imaginaries and pulling out an I, but we do know that the square root of 40 is going to break down into the square root of 4 times 10, which means that x is equal to 4 plus or minus 2 rad 10 all over 2. Each one of these things has a 2 in common, so we can say x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 10. Okay, because again, 4 divided by 2 is 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1, 2 divided by 2 is 1, and we're all good. 2 real solutions. Alright. Still using the discriminant first, because it's always, you're going to need it eventually to use the quadratic formula, so you might as well know what you're looking for. We're going to say b squared minus 4ac, so this is going to be 36 minus, well, 36. So our discriminant is equal to 0. If you look at your list, that means we are going to have exactly 1 real solution. Alright, now we got to go ahead and find it. So x equals opposite b plus or minus the square root of your discriminant all over 2a. And this is why we only have 1 real solution, because if your discriminant is 0, you lose the plus and the minus, because adding 0 and subtracting 0 is going to be exactly the same thing. So in this case, x is going to be equal to negative 3. And that counts as a double root, because again, it's touching the x-axis and bouncing back. Okay? Now, if you think about how that relates to all the work that we did with factoring, x squared plus 6x plus 9 would have factored into x plus 3 and x plus 3. So that means that x has to be equal to negative 3. That's our only option. Okay? Which means that on your graph at negative 3, your parabola is sitting right on the x-axis. Okay? The last 2 we could not have factored, so we didn't come out with rational numbers. We definitely needed the quadratic formula, or needed to complete the square, which we learned is the quadratic formula. Alright, so b squared b. Please make sure you're careful with order of operations when you're working with the discriminant. I'm always doing the exponents first, then I'm doing the multiplication. So 4 times 1 is 4, times negative 8 is negative 32, which means it's going to be 4 plus 32. Our discriminant is equal to 36. If our discriminant is positive, that means we have two real solutions. The fact that it's a perfect square means that they are going to be rational solutions. We won't have a messy square root at the end. X equals the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root. Our discriminant was 36, all over 2a. So the square root of 36 is 6, which is why we lose that irrational part. Now we got to go through and just get our final answer. So you want to read this as negative 2 plus 6, which is going to be 4, divided by 2 is 2. And negative 2 minus 6 is negative 8, divided by 2 is negative 4. And again, if you would have started with this one and factored it, this would have factored into x plus 4 and x minus 2, which means that x would have been negative 4 or positive 2 from our factoring unit before. Alright, so using the discriminant, this b squared minus 4ac, your options are either 2 real if it's positive, 1 real if it's 0, and 2 imaginary if it's negative. Okay? I'm going to say you should write 2 imaginary solutions because you're going to have i's in your answer. It makes sense to do the discriminant first because then you've already done the work in the quadratic formula, alright? And you know what type of answers you're looking for. One more time for all of your entertainment, you can maybe sing along with me. X equals opposite b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.